Everything in Java is actually part of a class, and this includes all of the functions. These functions are known as, in Java, are known as methods, right? And even main is a method of a class. In C++, you are familiar with class, so in Java, the classes are declared in a similar form. So they can be public or private. Okay, so now that I explained what is an object, so object is a sample of a class. So let's see what is a class and what are the components of one class. Here in this slide, you can see a very simple example of one class. In the next slides, I'm going to explain each them in details, so don't worry if you don't know some of them. So as you see, this class, the name of this class is circle, right? So if you consider a circle has the radius, right? And what you can do by that radius is computing the area of that circle and computing the circumference of that circle, right? So, you know now, a circle has a radius. You can compute the area, you can compute the circumference of the area. And also, you can assign the value to that radius, right? So as you see, radius is actually the variable for the class, and these actions means computing the area or computing the circumference or assigning the value to the radius they are actions, right? So they are the methods of the class, okay? Well, so now let's see how we can implement this class in Java, okay? So the name of the class is circle, right? As a variable, we have radius, so private double radius. The value for this one is, for example, by default is 1. Now, don't worry if you don't know, for example, why private, right? So I will explain them more in details. Then I have public circle and public circle double R, right? So these two are the constructors of circle. One doesn't receive anything as the input parameters and doesn't do anything as you see, and the other one receives as the input the radius, right, and will set the radius, right? So if we, for example, call the first one, we will have um, an object. We will have a sample of this class. And if we call the second one, we will have a sample of this class, but we have a value for the radius. So that's the difference between calling the first circle, right, and the second circles, public circle and public circle double R. So these two are called constructors, okay? I'm going to explain more about constructors in the next slide. So don't worry if you don't know constructors, but probably the majority of you know because it actually works the same as constructor in C++. Then as you see, we have 4 methods: set radius, get radius, find area, and find circumference. So these are methods, they do some actions. The first one is set radius. So what it does, it receives a value, right, the radius, check that value. If that's greater than 0, then we'll assign that value as a value of the radius of this circle. The second one So that's the set radius. The second one we have get radius. Get radius, this method is responsible for returning the value of the radius. So if we call this method, right, what it does, it returns the radius of this circle. Then we have find area method. Hope that's a method, right? This method is going to compute the area of the circle based on the radius, and it's going to return this area. Okay, so you know the formula of the area, radius multiplied by radius multiplied by pi, right? And finally, circumference. Circumference is another method for computing the circumference of the circle. It will compute the circumference based on the method, based on this formula, radius multiplied by 2 multiplied by pi, and we're going to return this value. So as you see, this is a very simple class named circle. It has one variable and several methods. Two of these methods are actually constructors, right? They are used to initialize objects from this class, and four are methods that do something. For example, we'll set the radius, we'll return the radius, we'll compute the area, and we'll compute the circumference. Okay, now you already know that everything in Java is a part of class, right? So first, we will define a class. The next step will be creating the object. So let's see what is exactly an object and how we can create the objects. Objects are actually samples of classes. So we create the objects from classes. How? With the operator new. So the operator that we use in Java to create an object from a class is new. There is two steps to create an object. First, we need to declare a reference variable. Okay, and the type of this reference variable is actually that class. Right, and after creating the object reference variable, we need to create the object by new and attach that object to this reference variable. So this is the two steps that we can create the object from a class. Okay, so you can see some examples here. For example, first, let's see the format. Okay, so as you see the format here, first for declaring the object reference variable, first you need to write down the class name and then the name of that object reference variable. That's the name that you specify. Okay, so this is the first step. So class name, object reference. The next step is creating the object with new and then attach that object to that variable. So first that variable object reference equals new class name. Okay, so that's the format that you need to keep in mind. You can combine these two steps in one step and write it in one line of code. Okay, so how? As you see here, class name object reference equals new class name. Declaring that variable and creating the object, both in one step. You can see some simple examples here. For example, we have a class with the name myCircle. Excuse me, with the name circle. And we want to create an object from that class. How? First, circle, then the name of the reference variable. Here, for example, my circle. So circle, my circle. Then my circle equals new circle. Here I have created an object from that class. Okay. Or for example, I have a class named dog and I want to create an object from that class. How? And the name of that object be, for example, Fido, right? So dog, Fido equals new dog, right? That's some very simple examples. So here, there is a very important point that you need to keep in mind, okay? Here we have as I mentioned, we have the reference variable, right? We will declare the reference variable. The point here is that this variable is the reference variable. So when you declare this reference variable and you create the object, this reference variable is actually referring to that object. It's not like this variable is that object. No, this variable is referring to the object. So, for example, if you create two objects and then, as you see in this example, assign their variables together, for example, C1 and C2, it's not like the C2 be copied into C1. No. Now, because both of them are a reference variable, right? Now, both of these variables are referring to the same object. Okay, now you know that how to create an object from a class, okay? So the next step in the program would be accessing to the data, to the variables of, for example, that class or to the methods of that class, right? So how we can do that? So the operator for accessing to internal methods and data is the dot operator. The format for that, for this task is, as you see here, first you need to write the object reference, then dot, and after dot you will write the name of that data or the name of that method. Here I've shown you one example based on the class that we had in the previous slides. So first, we create an object from this class, circle C1 b equals new circle. So now C1 is a reference variable referring to this object, and this object is an object of the class circle, right? That class had several methods and a variable radius, right? So now if I want to access to, for example, to radius and assign a value to this variable, I can write C1 dot radius, for example, equals 10. So C1, that's the name of that reference variable, right? Dot, that's the dot operator that I talked about. Radius is the variable inside the class. Or if I want to, for example, call a method inside that class, that's the same. For example, I had a method named findArea, right? So how I can call this method by writing down C1, that's the name of the reference variable, dot, and then findArea. findArea is the name of the method. So that's the format that you need to keep in mind when you want to use the variables and the methods of a class. For example, you want to assign values to variables or you want to call the methods, you should follow this format. Okay, now when you create and when you first define a class, inside the class, you will have several constructors, right? So the purpose for creating the constructors is to handle object initialization, right? So that's the purpose, that we will have several constructors inside the class when we write down or create a class. Constructors in Java do the same way that in C++, and there are some points that you need to keep in mind. First, the constructor, the name of the constructor is the same as the name of the class, and we can have several constructors inside one class, right? And the constructors doesn't return anything, but they receive input. They may have 0 input or multiple inputs, right? So when you create an object from a class, actually you are invoking one of the constructors based on the parameter that you put inside the parentheses, right? Based on the variable, the input that you put inside the parentheses. So for example, in the class that we had in the previous slides, I defined one class, right? And that class, the name of that class was circle. And if you see that class, it has 2 constructors, right? The first one is circle. It has no parameter and returns nothing. The second one is, again, the same name, circle. It receives a parameter r, and then inside it will set the radius, right? So we had 2 constructors. So we can use any of these 2 constructors to create one object, right? For example, here we have C1 new circle, or C2 new circle 9.0. So the first one, new circle, invokes the first constructor that has no parameter, and the second one invokes the second constructor that receives r as the input. Right here, 9 is actually that radius. Sometimes you need to pass the object that you have created from a class inside a method, right, as the input parameter, right? So I talked about the methods parameters in the previous sessions. I mentioned that, for example, when you pass a variable inside a method as a parameter, a copy of that variable will be created and will be passed into the method. So the original value of that variable will not change, right? Or when you pass an array as an input parameter into a method, and inside the method, if we change the values of the elements of that array, then the original values of those elements inside the array will change, right? Because in this case, the original array will be passed inside the method, right? So that's the same for objects. So when you pass an object into a method, right, actually you are passing the reference to that object to the method, right? So now if you make any change to the variables or any part of that object, those changes will be applied to the original object, right? Because what you have passed is the actual reference to that object. So you should keep it in mind when you are going to pass objects as the input parameters to the methods. Okay, so when you are going to create a class and then you are going to create the objects, some samples from that class, here there is a very important point that you need to keep in mind about variables and about the methods. So variables and methods of a class can be static or can be non-static. So I'm going to explain what it means by making a variable static or making a method static, and what is the difference between them and the difference between them in accessing them, right? So if we make a variable to be static in a class, it means if we create objects from that class, then if we create several objects, for example, that all of those objects will access to that variable. So they can change that variable, they can see the change, right? So we have one fixed variable inside the class and all of the objects can change that variable. This variable, this is a static variable, right? And we have it inside the class. This variable also can be recognized by the methods, actually by the static methods of the class, right? So the static methods that we have inside the class can access to this variable. But if a variable is instance, it means it's not static. We don't use the static modifier in declaration of that variable in the class, right? Then this variable will be created when an object is created. So when we create one object, one copy of this variable will be created. When we create the second object, another copy of this variable will be created. So each object of each sample of the class, each object has one separate variable, right? And that's the instance variable, right? So the methods that are static in the class don't have access to this type of variables. Why? The reason is that these variables only exist when an object exists. When we create one object, these variables will be created, right? So actually it's like we don't have them. Just we have them when we create an object, when we create a sample of this class. So those methods that are static inside the class cannot access to this variable. So we cannot, when we are going to write some statements for our static methods of the class, we cannot use these type of variables inside the statements, but we can use the static variables. So that's an important point that you need to keep in mind. So that's about static variables and instance variable. What about methods? So methods in a class, the same as variables, can be static or they can be non-static. Static means they are fixed, right? So it means when you want to call this type of methods, you don't need to create any object because they are static. They are already exist inside the class. You just need to write the name of the class and then dot and then the name of that method. Exactly like what we saw for math. When we wanted to use the sqrt method in the math class, we used to write math.sqrt, right? We don't need to create a sample from this class. We don't need to create an object. But when the methods are not static, it means they are instance method. In this situation, we need to first create an object, create one sample from the class. Then, when we want to call that method, we can first write the name of the object, then dot, then the name of that method. Okay, so that's the difference between a method being static and a method being non-static. And that's obvious that the methods that are static can have access to static variables. They cannot access to non-static variables. And the methods that are instance methods, right, they can have access to instance variables. So that's the point that you need to keep in mind. The other point here is sometimes you want to make a variable of a class to be constant. It means you want to assign a value to that variable and you want to make that value to be fixed, right? So that value won't be changed. So if you remember in Java, we use the word final in order to make a variable constant. So here I want to say that it's good to use to make this type of variables static as well, because the value of this variable will not change. So it's more efficient if we have one variable that is shared among all of the objects. So each object don't need to create a sample, right? So that's the reason. So we can make the constant variables to be static. Okay, so here I have a class student, right? So each student has a grade, test grade, and I'm going to, for example, keep the keep track number of students. So I have, I'm going to add students, right? And each time that I'm going to add students, I'm going to assign a value to its grade, and also I'm going to increase the number of students because I'm going to increase the number of students because one student has been created, right? So that's what I'm going to do. Based on that, I have this class. I've created this class student, right? So as you see, it has a variable. The name of this variable is test grade. So this test grade is actually the grade of each student. This variable should be instance, right? It means when I create one object, when I create one sample from this class, this variable will be copied. So now each object has its separate test grade variable, right? So this test grade is non-static or is instance. And also, this variable is not possible to be used inside the methods that are static. Then we have number of students or num students. As a default, the value of this variable is 0. This variable is static. It means all of the objects, all of the students are going to access to this variable. They don't need to create a separate copy. All of them can change the value of this variable, and all of them can see the value of this variable, right? So this variable is fixed among all of the objects. So that's static. And this variable is, because it's static, can be used inside the static methods, right? Then I have points possible. So this variable is going to be constant because I have used here final, that's the word final, is constant, and so the value that has been assigned to this variable won't be changed, cannot be changed by methods or by objects, and it's static. So now all of the objects have access to this variable. They don't need to create a separate copy. All of them has access to this original variable, right? So that's final static. Final, the value is fixed, cannot be changed. Static, this variable can be accessed by all of the objects without creating a copy. Then I have some methods. So the first one is constructor student. The second one is public void set grade, right? This method is a instance method. So when I create one object, right, then this method can be called, right? Can be can be called. So by creating one object from this class and calling this method, right? For example, student1, and then student1.setGrade. So then this method would be called, right? And a value would be assigned to the test grade of that student. That's the same for getGrade. GetGrade is an instance method, right? So I need to create one object and then I can call this method. So now, for example, I have student1 I can say student1.getGrade. So by writing down student1.getGrade, I can access to the grade of that student, right? Public static void increment number of students. That's a method that is going to increase the number of students each time I create one sample, one object, one student, right? So this one, as you see, is static, and inside this method, I can use just the static variables. What is the static variable here is number of students. So the point here is, in order to call this method, I don't need to initialize, I don't need to create objects. I can easily write student.increment number of students. Right, so this method would be called. And as you see, it increased the number of students. And I have public static int get number of students, right? It's going to return the number of students. So here again, for calling this method, I don't need to write, or I don't need to create the object. I easily can write students dot get number of students. So now by writing down this way, calling this method, since it's static, it's going to return the number of students, right? Here, for example, is 0 or whatever it is. Okay, so let's see a very simple example. In this example, I'm going to create first a class, and then I'm going to use this class by creating the objects from this class, right? So first, the name of this class is going to be student, right? So class student, and this class is going to have several variables, private, as I showed you in this slide. First, test grade. So test grade, right? Private, static, int, number of students, b0, private, final, static, int, point, possible, b 100. Right, so we have these methods, and then we are going to have we have these variables. Then we are going to have some methods. First, public student, that's a constructor, right? Public student, it's going to assign test grade b0. Then we are going to have public void set grade int gr. So here test grade b gr, public int get grade So here, return test grade. And public static void increment the number of students, right? So increment number of students. So here I'm going to increase the number of students. This one, this variable, right? So number of students plus. Public static int get number of students. And here I'm going to return the number of students, right? Right. So that's the class that I have. So this class, the name of this class is students. It has three variables and it has several methods, right? So the first one is the constructor. The other methods, set grade, get grade, increment number of students, and get number of students. So these are the methods that we have. So now I'm going to have the main method, right? And inside the main method, I'm going to create objects and also change the variables and see how we can, right? So public static void main string args. So here is going to system.out println number of students is, so here I'm going to print the number of students, right? Here I'm going to print the number of students, right? So as I mentioned, the number of students here is static, right? This is public. So, sorry, this is a static, right? So, I don't need to create an object in order to, um, no, not this one. I mean the method. So here I'm going to return the number of students, right? Which method returns the number of students? This one, right? Return number of students. This method is uh, this method is static as you see here, right? So since it's static, so it's going to return, it's going to, when we are going to call this method, we don't need to create an object to be able to call this method. We can easily call this method, right? So student, by writing student dot get number of students. And then here now I want to create two objects, student number 1 and student number 2. So student S1 and S2, right? And then S1 be new students, new student. S2 be new student, right? So now I have two students, S1 and S2. Okay, now I have two objects, S1 and S2, right? The next step is I want to say, for example, the grade for the student number 1 be, for example, 90, and the grade for student number 2 be 75, right? So here that I have these objects, now I can call the instance methods. What are the instance methods here? Set grade and get grade, right? So now that I want to set a grade for each of these students, I can use this method, set grade, right? So I will write S1 dot set grade. So you see, I can see it here, set grade, and for example, 90. And by creating a object, I can increase the number of students. So S1 dot increment number of students, right? And then S2 dot set grade 75, and S2 dot increment number of students here. So now by these lines of code, I've set a grade to S1. I've incremented the number of students, right, by 1. I've set a grade to student number 2, 75. I've increased the number of students by 1 again. So now this increment number of students increase the number of students by 1 each time. So now number of students first was 0, now it is 2, right? Then now let's print the grade for each of these students. So system.out.println. So student 1 grade is, for example, student 1 grade is. So now I'm going to return the grade of student number 1. So S1 dot, which method should be called here? So now, as you see, get grade method, right, should be called. As you see, it returns the grade of the student. So S1 dot get grade, right? System dot out dot println student 2 grade was S2 dot get grade, right? And finally, I want to print the number of students. So This one, get number of students, returns the number of students, right? So I can write system.out.println number of students is plus student dot get number of students. Okay, so let's run this code. By running the code, as you see, number of students is 0. Here, first the number of students is 0, and then student 1 grade is 90, student 2 grade is 75, and number of students for student after adding these two students is 2 now, right? So here the point is about the keyword this. You already know about this keyword in C++, right? So that's a pointer to the current card calling object. In Java, this is a reference variable, right, to the current calling object. So it's referring to the current object. It can also be used in order to call one constructor inside another constructor. Exactly the same as what you see here. You see, we have two constructors with different parameter list. The first one has 3 parameters, the second one has 2. In the second one, we have used these with 3 parameters. So by using that, we are actually calling the constructor with 3 parameters. Okay, let's see another example. I'm going to call this class to be fraction. Okay, so this class has two variables. The first one is numerator and the other one is denominator, right? So private int numerator b, for example, 0, private int denominator be 1, right? So these two are two values. Then we are going to have a constructor public fraction, right? So it's a constructor. And the next constructor, public fraction int n, right? So here, um, and another constructor, so this is one construct, it receives two parameters, int n and int d, right? So here I'm going to say if set n and d is false, then I'm going to set 0 and 1. So I'm going to explain what exactly set is, right? So I have a method public boolean set int n and int d, right? So if d is greater than 0, I'm going to say numerator b and denominator be d and return true, right? Else, I'm going to return false. So that's the set method. So the type is Boolean. It receives numerator and denominator, right? It will check denominator. If that's greater than 0, okay, it will set denominator and the denominator of this class to be n and d and will return true, else it will return false. So in this constructor, first we will check set to be what is the value of set, whether it's true or false. If it's false, right, then it means we have this situation. So d is 0, right? So we will set d to be 1. So set 0 and 1, right? So that's one constructor. Another one is this one, right? That doesn't do anything, it just will create an object. The next one is public fraction. It's going to receive nominator and by receiving the nominator, it's going to call this one, right? So this n and 1. So these are some 3 constructors that we have. You see here we use this. By using this, we are actually calling this constructor, and we have this method for setting the values. Then we have another method in order to show denominator and denominator, right? So public void show, it's going to print something for the user. So system.out.print a numerator and denominator. I think I spelled this something, but it's numerator, right? Numerator and denominator. Okay. So this is another method. It's going to print these two on the output, right? And I'm going to have some other methods. Another method in order to return the string format of numerator and denominator, right? So it's going to concatenate numerator and denominator and return that as a string. So public string to string system.out.print numerator denominator. denominator, right? And again, some methods in order to get numerator and denominator. So public int gets numerator return numerator, and public int get denominator and return denominator. Right. So now in the main method, I'm going to create some objects for this from this class and call the methods. So as you see, this class, the name of this class is fraction. It has two variables, right? The default value for these two is 0 and 1. Both of them are instance variables. It has three constructors. The first one just create an object. The second one call the third one. And the third one, as you see, will check set, and if set is false, then we'll set 0 and 1, right? I have some methods. The first one is set. Set is responsible for assigning the values to numerator and denominator, right? And another method show in order to print these two on the output. Another method to string for concatenating these two and showing them as one string on the output, and two other methods which are instance methods in order to assigning values, in order to returning the values of numerator and denominator of each object. Right, so you see that all of them, all of these methods are instance methods, right? We didn't have any static. Okay, so let's create object. So fraction, the name of the class, and then the name of the object, for example, F1 and F2. Then now I've declared, now I'm going to create the object. I've declared the reference variables. I'm going to create the objects and then assign those objects to my reference variables. So F1b new for creating the object, fraction, right? F2b new fraction, right? This one fraction 3 and 5. So what's the difference between these two? This one will create this object. This one will invoke the first constructor, right? Because it doesn't have any parameter, so it will invoke this one. But this one will invoke the third constructor because of its parameter list. It has two integer n and d, right? Okay, so that's the difference. And you see here. So now what I want to do is I want to see the numerator and denominator of these objects, right? So system dot out dot print. Okay, the fraction f1 is fraction f1 is right f1 dot show. So show is an instance method, and as I told you, in order to call instance methods, we need to create the object. I already have objects, right? F1 and F2. I want to see the fraction of F1, right? So F1 dot show. So if you see here, F1, this is the F1, right? So actually, as a default, numerator and denominator is 0 and 1. So here I should see 0 divided by 1, right? Let's see. Okay, let's run the code and see there is an error. In this line, it says missing return statement. Yes, because here we have a string, but we don't return anything, so it needs to be returned. So as you see, fraction f1 is 0 divided by 1, right? 0 divided by 1. So it will call show here, and since the default value for numerator and denominator is 0 and 1, we will see 0 divided by 1. Okay, so let's see this one for F2, right? Okay, so let's see system dot out dot print plus F2, right? Let's see what we can see here. So 3 divided by 5, right? Since F2 here has 3 and 5, right? So this one will be invoked, right, if it will call the set here. So we will have set n and d. So d is greater than 5. So it will assign 3 as the numerator and 5 as the denominator, and will return true, right? And since it's true, right, it's not false, this line won't be executed. But here, these two lines of code, we will have these two lines of code, right? So now numerator and denominator, they are actually instance variables. Instance variables for F2 would be 3 and 5. And here we are actually calling the toString. This one, this method, toString. So this one will be called, and we will see this one, this message will be returned. right? So here, this one uses toString, right? Let's set some different numerator and denominator for our objects. So system dot out dot and then print the result, print ln. So let's see for the set what we have here. So it would be n calling f1 dot set 11 and 14. Let's run the code. Okay, so set 11 and 14. So if I run this code, it's calling true, right? So that's a very simple example about the class and how we could call the related methods. I hope it helps you to understand it.